tuning in. Um, After I skipped the last Saturday, I apologize, but now we're back, and we're gonna keep doing this every Saturday in the future. I might even do a midweek stream sometime because Twitch wants everyone to be affiliate, and it turns out that to be an affiliate, you need to stream not 8 times total, but you need to stream 8 times in a 30-day period. So you can't do it weekly. It might be uh, bi-weekly, semi-weekly. I'm not sure which one means twice a week and every 2 weeks. I mean, the one that is twice a week, maybe. I'm not sure. So today's topic is, as was recommended to me by Patreon backers, uh, the topic is urban rapid transit in big developing world cities. I believe the prompt was developing world megacities, but I'm not going to do just megacities, of which there aren't that many. Yes, there's Karachi, there's let's say Dhaka, Lagos, Cairo, but there are lots of really interesting cases. They're not megacities, but they're still very large cities. I imagine they will become megacities in the future. And it is my belief that all of them should be building toward having a subway system. And BRT might be a step toward that future, but the future needs to involve a subway. And I want to, uh, and I want to explain why. I want to explain how. I want to explain some problems that are rather unfortunate in this set of countries. So first of all, most importantly, what is a developing country? So I'm going to look at GDP per capita for a moment for a number of different countries. So let's do America, Italy, Russia, China. Let's do Mexico. Mexico is actually richer than China. Um, and now we're going to get into countries where I don't remember the exact ranking. There is going to be there's Brazil, which is poorer than China by a little bit. Let's do Peru, uh, India, and I can do 10 of these before the system starts hitting me. So let's do Bangladesh, and as an African case, let's do Kenya. Um, so are these all correct? Yes, they are. I think they're also in order. I'm not sure. Okay, not quite. Or maybe they are. Okay, so the developed world, so the first world, consists. I'm not going to define what exactly is a developed country, but on this list that they provided, two countries are very clearly first world countries. These are the United States and Italy. And I did not choose these countries at random. I chose them because among the big countries, the United States is the wealthiest. And it's all about annual income per capita, so we're not going to talk about things like productivity or the United States versus Germany, just raw GDP per capita. This is what we have. The United States is, all of this is in, by the way, PPP 2017 dollars, a little over 60K a year. Italy, a little over 40K. This is roughly the spread. I think Spain is comparable to Italy, maybe a little bit poorer. Greece is somewhat poorer, Israel, South Korea, but that's basically the spread. So this is a spread of about 1.5. And again, you can go a little bit lower if you're looking at, I don't know, Portugal. And also, so the United States-Italy spread is also a spread that's getting wider. Look at where it was before eurosclerosis. But maybe back then Spain was poor, Portugal was poor. Um, so when we talk about developed countries, these are countries that are actually rather similar to each other. So is Italy poorer than the United States? Absolutely. I can point you exactly what it means that Italy is poor. For example, it is rather common in Italy for unmarried adults to still live with their parents. This is common all over Southern Europe and I think also in Eastern Europe. It is uncommon in the United States, in France, in Northern Europe, just because people can afford to move out and live alone. And this is not even a housing price artifact. You go to Rome, the prices there are much lower than they are even in Berlin, let alone in, for example, Paris, London. So again, poorer country, 1.5 to 1 spread, which is, that spread is not enough to make the United States better than Italy at everything. It isn't. I mean, Italy has higher life expectancy. But at most things, the United States is going to be better than Italy. Public transport construction is obviously a very big exception. It's a place where Italy rather shines. Um, but, um, but this is basically the spread. Again, countries are rather similar. You can notice the differences in living standards, but even at this spread, and the spread with the US and Germany is much narrower, there are some trade-offs. And then you look within the developed, within not the developed, sorry, within the developing world. And I'm gonna not look at Russia for a moment. Russia faces about the same spread with Italy as Italy with the United States. My guess is that if I were to ask people on Twitter, so my Twitter followers maybe are interested in issues of policy and maybe in global issues, but probably do not memorize the GDP per capita of every country. And I ask them this, they would probably make a similar guess. And I'm going to not cover Russia in this video. Russia is a little bit too rich, and because of its communist history, this is the communist history. So the spread between Russia and the United States was 2-1 when communism fell. And it was actually narrower before the stagnation of the era leading up to the fall of communism. I think the spread was, I do not actually know when the spread was at its minimum. I'm guessing maybe in the 1970s. But the point is that Russia has the subway system of a fully developed country. But if you when you start going lower, it's going to be different, even if the GDPs are somewhat close. But the point is that when you start going to Mexico, Mexico is about 20. So remember, the US is 60,000, Italy is 40. Mexico is 20, and Kenya is 4. So it's a spread of between Mexico and Kenya of almost 5-1, maybe 4.5-1. And again, the US and Italy is 1.5. So it's just a much wider spread. So when we talk about developing countries, it's really important, first of all, to understand that we are lumping in solidly middle income countries, things like Mexico, China, Brazil, and countries with widespread illiteracy, with very limited access to indoor plumbing in the cities, with very little state penetration, which is not maybe relevant in cities, but even in cities, the state doesn't necessarily provide services very much within the slums. So maybe some corporation figures out that those people actually have disposable income, but it's all very informal. So you have a very big informal economy in the in the parts of the country that are not the big cities. So sometimes, especially the rural areas, often traditional arrangements trump any kind of state law. This is something that I learned from the liberal feminist economist Alice Evans. She talks a lot about domestic violence specifically in Africa. She explains because these are very poor countries and population density is low, which is very different from the situation in South Asia, where India is very poor, Bangladesh is very poor, Pakistan is very poor, but they're very densely populated. Whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, the population density is for the most part low, and there's a lot of poverty, and state capacity is underdeveloped. So the outcome of this is that villages tend to be hours from the nearest police station. So she studies in the sense of domestic violence because maybe the cops think that domestic violence is bad. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but it doesn't matter what they think because the cops don't run the show in a village that's hours away from the nearest police station. So again, these are problems that you see in Kenya, and again, without the bit about state penetration, this is something that is also common in South Asia. That is not going to be the case in China or in most of Latin America. So this is really important to distinguish these. So I'm going to try to cover things that are applicable to this entire group. And finally, I'm going to drop the richer countries for a moment and just point something out. I think it'll be useful if I click the right button. You can go well below Kenya. So let's do Uganda. I don't remember the code for the DRC, so What's another good example? So what's an example of a country where I actually remember the code for it? Ghana is going to be similar to Kenya. What else is there? Tanzania, Uganda, I think is more than Tanzania. There is, and I don't want to be just East Africa. Um, we're going to actually Google this. DRC, I guess. Okay. And the DRC has Kinshasa. Yep. The DRC has Kinshasa, which is either a mega city or about to become one. So I talked about the 4.5 to 1 spread in income between Mexico and Kenya. Well, there's about there's 4 to 1 spread between Kenya and the DRC. So I'm gonna cut it at. I'm not gonna discuss the DRC. It's far too poor for any discussion of subways are to be really valuable. But in Kenya, they actually need to be thinking about it. And they are, by the way. I'm not. When I'm saying Kenya is poor and Kenya needs subways, I'm not saying anything that other people haven't already thought about. But now we're going to talk about what they need, and we're going to talk about why they need subways. So something that is important to understand about developing world cities is that they tend to be fast growing or have demand for lots of growth. Now, obviously, this is also something that is true in, let's say, New York City. In New York City, the population is 8.5 million. The metro area is maybe 22, 23 if you count New Haven as part of the New York metropolitan area. But many people want to live there. So the population of the New York metropolitan area is famously stagnant. If you know anything about American demographic patterns, you know that people have been on net moving away from the East Coast and the Midwest and toward the Sun Belt, which traditionally meant California, Texas, Florida. At this point, it's not even California. It's Texas, Florida, some southern states like maybe Georgia, North Carolina. But you probably also know that New York is very expensive. People want to live there, they just don't build enough housing in New York. So New York, again, has very high growth demand. But I don't actually think New York has a higher growth demand than developing world megacities. Not maybe not Mexico City. But Mexico is a very urbanized country. Brazil, same. Maybe they're not as urbanized as the US or Germany, but they're very urbanized. But then you start looking at India. India is about 1/3 urban. So India urbanization rate, I believe it's 1/3. Yeah. So about 34% of India lives in cities. And if you want to look at things like list of largest metropolitan areas in India, let's say the million plus one, it's a very small proportion of the population. And it's not even that it's like, let's say France. In France, the million plus metro areas don't have a large proportion of the population either because people live in metropolitan areas of, let's say, 200, 300, 400, 500,000. India, it's not like that. 2/3 of the population lives in villages. And again, if you probably know anything about development economics, is that urbanization is part of development. Urban wages are much higher than rural ones, and urban living standards are much higher than rural ones. It used to be that moving to the city meant having to take a big penalty to public health because, for example, in the Western world, until I believe the beginning of the 20th century, mortality rates were actually higher in cities than they were in rural areas because people lived closer together. So there was higher incidence of infectious disease. And then first of all, with the discovery of germ theory of disease and the improvement in hygiene subsequent to that, things like indoor plumbing, sewer systems, and just general public understanding of the importance of avoiding infectious disease, urban mortality rates actually fell below rural ones. And today, even in very poor countries, my understanding is it's like, let's say, the United States after the beginning of the 20th century, not before. And it's hard necessarily to say, because, for example, with Corona, there's a question: does it affect cities more than rural areas? And there are big reporting artifacts. My understanding is that in India, mortality rates from Corona, at least in 2020, I have no idea about the current wave. But my understanding is in 2020. So India Corona excess mortality. Let me see if I can find the paper. It is not this one. It is not this one. Uh, okay, it is not this. Access death. Or you call it COVID. It's not gonna be from here. Um, Again, it's not gonna be from The Economist, but there's a. But okay, now I'm annoyed that I can't find this paper. It's from 2020. Texas deaths 2020. But I'm furiously looking for the paper. But the point is that the paper argues that in excess deaths, it's actually worse in rural India than in urban India. And in reported deaths, it's the other way around, but there was a lot of rural underreporting, is what I'm trying to say, and I can't actually find the paper anymore. I guess because India currently has, currently, I guess it's because India has such an ongoing wave. Asking about corona deaths in India in 2020 is a little bit like asking about corona deaths in Europe in, I don't know, March of 2020, as opposed to the more recent wave. Um, Gabon and Benin are, so no, actually Gabon has high GDP per capita. Um, Gabon is, Gabon might actually have sub-Saharan Africa's highest GDP per capita. Yeah. What is the, it's GA. I have one more country that I can add. Gabon, so in general, if you see high GDP per capita in a country in Africa that is between the Sahara and the Kalahari, it is not because it's actually rich. So it's not like Gabon has similar living standards to China. It doesn't. It's just that these are countries that are very low population density and are resource rich. So this is the density in Gabon. And yes, Africa has lower density than the populated parts of Asia, so not Mongolia, but 8 per square kilometer is still abnormally low. It's just very resource rich for how for 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 its population, but it's not really growing. So you can see that Gabon is actually poorer than it was 30 years ago. So it's something you can also to some extent see in the Arab world with the Gulf states. That's they have high GDP per capita, was traditionally a fake number, um, especially in the 70s when they were a lot wealthier per capita than the United States, but didn't look that way. And at this point, um, they've sort of converged and they look something approximating a normal developing country, sorry, a normal developed country. Again, they don't look as wealthy as the GDP per capita might indicate, I don't think, but the GDP per capita has converged downward, and the and actual development has converged upward. And in Gabon, it's just, I mean, it's still in the process. Um, but anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of demand whenever you don't have full urbanization for people to move to the cities. This is why urbanization happens. Um, Urbanization is something that happens in general without coercion. Yes, there are exceptions, but usually if there's state coercion, it's much more likely to ruralize a population, especially a population that it views as undesirable. So you have infamous examples like the Khmer Rouge forcibly expelling the population of Phnom Penh, but much less extreme examples than this exist all over. You have the Chinese Hukou system. You have the you have in the Soviet Union. There was something called, let me see if it's Kilometer 101 USSR. Yeah, there was this. So in the Soviet Union, if you were a dissident, they wouldn't let you live in the cities. So there was so people were not allowed to live within 100 kilometers of uh, of Moscow. So there was something called the 101st kilometer. And so, so in general, a coercive state is more likely to restrain urban growth than to force it. And when you have disruption of um, traditional rural arrangements, and you see disruption, when economic disruption, I mean political disruption. Usually, it does not try to urbanize people. So, we had to destroy the village in order to save it mentality in the Vietnam War was very coercive. The United States would take Vietnamese villages where there was any suspicion of Viet Cong sympathy, and they would take them out of where they lived and they put them in barbed wire camps. But they didn't move them to Saigon. They moved them to small camps, but they were not meaningfully urban. Um, so my point is that urbanization is something that happens because people individually choose it, often against the wishes of the urban and the rural elite. The rural elite would like to be able to hold on to the peasants. The urban elites think that rural people are smelly and want to keep them out. And yet it happens. So remember, India is about 1/3 urban, but and maybe right now there's not immediate demand for it because maybe urban rents in India are very high, so that creates kind of equilibrium. But over time, urbanization happens. The upshot of this is that if you're a city in a poor country, and again, I don't even mean Mexico or China, I mean India and anything poorer than India, um, you should expect massive population growth through internal migration. Moreover, it's likely you should expect large population growth due to natural growth. And again, maybe South Asia is not the best example. So right now, India, the expectation here is that it should grow from 1.4 billion to a little bit more through natural growth. Again, it depends on the country. So in Pakistan, the birth rates are actually higher. So right now it's 220, and it's expected to grow to grow pretty seriously in the next couple generations. Um, and then usually again, it's in the poorer countries usually that you see the highest population growth. So in Nigeria, it's expected to get to roughly where Europe is today, and I don't mean the EU, I mean all of Europe by 2100. So just through natural population growth, and even if birth rates fall a lot in the future, yes, it's gonna bend the curve, but um, the people who are gonna have children in Nigeria in 25 years, for example, are this cohort. So it doesn't. So even if they have fewer children, they're just a much bigger cohort. This is called demographic momentum, by the way, and this is why natural population growth stays positive long after birth rates fall even below replacement rates. In, for example, Japan. So in Japan, the population is currently falling. It peaked in, I guess, 2005, 2010. But birth rates in Japan went below replacement well before that. I think it was maybe in the 70s already. It's just that because of this demographic momentum. So let's say the um, early boomers, let's say, having children, you kind of see the echo boom. So you have the early boomers, so these cohorts having children, and this led to an echo boom. Even if the total fertility rates were very much not what they used to be. I think at this point, this would have been people born in the 70s. I think at this point, Japan was actually already at replacement, give or take. The cohort is basically the same size. Um, and of course, it goes in reverse in Japan if they if they start having very natalist views. It's going to be these people who have children, so it's going to so population growth will remain negative or stagnant. But we're not talking about Japan. We're talking again Nigeria can expect very high natural population growth. It should expect very large migration into the cities. And this migration is also something that South Asia, which has way lower birth rates, should be expecting. So the cities should understand that they should all grow much bigger. And it doesn't. And by the way, Kenya has. I am misspelling things. I am still misspelling things. Okay. I am not. So you see that in Kenya, the birth rates are actually lower than most of the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So they expect population not to go by a factor of 3.5, only slightly more than double in the remainder of the century. But still, that's still a lot of growth. That's a lot of urbanization. Um, Moreover, um, the urban geography is likely to change. And what do I mean by likely to change is that if you live in a, I don't like calling them slums because the expression slums has too many different connotations they want to avoid. For example, slum might be a common way to describe poor neighborhoods in mid 20th century America, which were not the neighborhoods that are not neighborhoods that I want to compare to third world slums, but are the neighborhood but they replaced the equivalent of the third world slums. So I'm going to call them squats. So things like Kaipera, Dharavi, so neighborhoods that are heavily based on informal arrangements. Um, but there's a really good book about this, by the way. It's called Shadow Cities by Robert Neuwirth. Um, it is an ethnography of four uh, four different neighborhoods, and I only remember the name of one of them, which is Hosinya in Rio. So it's about the favelas in Rio, the slums in Mumbai. Um, it's about in Nairobi. I'm forgetting whether it went to Kibera or to another slum that is maybe less famous than Kibera. And in Turkey, he went to one of the original squats, which are called, I believe, Gecekondu, and are at this point barely even look like squats because they were very heavily legalized. Um, but you could kind of see how these look different from other urban neighborhoods just on a satellite map. And this is, by the way, where I'm not going to do just megacities. Nairobi is not a megacity. Nairobi will be a megacity. I don't know when, but it will be a megacity. But you can kind of see the difference between very formal parts of Nairobi. So this is central. So if I were to show you this um, urban street layout, you would not be able to tell there's anything third world about this. Um, Now you might know, given the location of the golf courses and the ornamental lawns, that maybe this would have had British colonial influence, which it absolutely did. This is why you have in a very poor city golf courses adjacent to city center. But or likewise, if you start looking at the formal neighborhoods where the middle class lives, so this is so it's mostly going north. This is an area called Westlands and Parklands. And yeah, and if you look at it on a satellite, it just looks like urban street grid. Um, and even the formal working class area. So this is Eastleigh. It is a working class neighborhood. The population of Eastleigh is, as I understand it, mostly Somali immigrants. Um, it is also, I will not be able to find a link, but it is from Market Urbanism on Twitter. He found a link to the zoning in Nairobi, and he pointed out that, again, the urban elites don't like people moving there because they think that poor people are dirty, from the urban poor people are dirty, rural poor people are dirty, so they have very strict zoning over here. And I say it's strict, again, it's not single family acre lots or something, but it's still lower floor area ratios. I think maybe 1.5 or 2. And East actually has the densest zoning in Nairobi. I think it's a floor area ratio of about 3. And again, this is not a rich neighborhood. This is a poor neighborhood. But you look at the street network, and it's an urban street, right? The squats are different. The squats, because the streets are kind of public and squats are where you don't have a lot of state penetration. This is Gaibara, all of this. So can you notice that there's basically no street grid here? There absolutely are streets, but they're incredibly narrow. There's usually not a lot of urban service infrastructure. So they have electricity. They don't generally have running water. Um, and and you can kind of see that it's different. You don't have wide streets, for example. Um, and the contrast again, you look at the contrast. Look again at Eastleigh. Um, this is a pretty wide street. Um, and when you look at when you look at Eastleigh First Avenue and you try to compute the width of the street, and again, I did not pre-compute this, and this is okay, 25 meters, building to building, it looks like, and 25 meters is like a, I mean, it's not like Manhattan Avenue. Manhattan Avenues are 30, but it's a normal urban arterial road. Um, and then you look at, and again, this is a neighborhood street. It's something you might notice is important about it. It goes north-south. The neighborhood is east of city center. And this matters because it means that it is not on a road that would connect people to city center jobs. And things that are roads that connect people to city center jobs, you can kind of see that these are much wider roads. Things like this, like here. And so these are also the main Matatu routes. Let me see if we can find Nairobi Matatu route map. And they've actually been mapped very well. This is unusual. This is it's not they're usually very poorly mapped. It's not so these are private transit. So what do I mean by private transit? It's public transit in the sense that people can walk on, pay a fare, and get on and get to their destination. It's public in the sense of open to the public, but it's not run by the public sector. This is I guess where it matters that it's not called public transit in other languages. In French, it's called transport en commun, so common transit. In German, they say they call it öffentliche Nahverkehr, so open to the public transport. So this absolutely is public in that sense. It's not owned by the public, but it's not like any of the privatized things that you might be aware of from when they contract out something in let's say a European or Asian country or anything like the historic private railroads of the United States or the current private railroads of Japan. It's not like that. It's not corporate. It's not very coordinated. So usually you don't get maps for this. Whereas if you want to go on if you want to go on a private railroad in Japan, you can actually find schedules and maps for your favorite Japanese urban railway that you're going to use, let's say, to commute between a specific suburb and Tokyo. And usually you can't do this with jitneys. You're just expected to know. It's very much about this kind of local knowledge. But the Matatu have actually been mapped. Nairobi, my choice of Nairobi to zoom in on is not random. Nairobi, I can't tell why. Maybe it's UN presence or something, but Nairobi is much better known, I think, to the first world than our comparable cities of comparable size and wealth or lack thereof. It's noticeable that, for example, I haven't ever seen such a map for the downfall. Lagos, like Nairobi, is formerly Anglophone. It's a much bigger city. I think it might actually be a little bit richer. And you can kind of see that this is, it looks kind of like you can turn it into a subway map. And this is, so I actually download this. Kenya, Nairobi route map. And again, it's not a coincidence. This is all spontaneous, so it is often individual drivers or consortia figuring that they can get people from various neighborhoods to city center. And it's not like you have a big choice of what roads to follow. Okay, I mean, okay, if you don't particularly like one arterial, it's not like you can go on a parallel street. If you don't like Juja Road, it's not like there are parallel wide streets to Juja Road that you can go on, right? This is the only way you're getting from Matara Valley and from Islay to city center. So it's kind of a very organic urban growth. It's not necessarily a planned street network. They just see a street, they just see a destination that's being developed on the outskirts, and they just build a road there, and then they keep widening it. And this kind of urbanism, it's very it leads to a very star-shaped kind of system, but that's fine. This is how subways work. Maybe not in Paris or in Berlin, but it is how they work in Moscow. It is how they work in London. It is how they work in nearly all of China. This is, I think, how they should work. So that's not the big problem. Um, so with the matatu, um, the way they work is um, buses are incredibly labor intensive. And this is why BRT had to be developed in poor countries. I don't want to say not incredibly poor, nothing like that, but BRT, bus rapid transit, was invented in Brazil and perfected in Colombia. Why? Because the whole point of BRT is you put massive numbers of buses on roads. Um, infrastructure is expensive. Infrastructure is expensive even in poor countries. In fact, let me see if I can find the transit costs project GDP per capita. Okay, it's not going to get me to my actual transit costs website, but there's a. Okay, let me see if I can find it with data. Analysis and visualization. Notes in data analysis and what's the data? What does the data say? And I saw this page and I just don't remember the. Okay, so cost per kilometer, GDP. Yeah. Okay. So first of all, if you're wondering what whether there's a correlation here, the answer is yes, there is, and it is positive, but it is entirely an artifact of the fact that poor countries build more houses. And maybe you need to strain a little bit to see this in the graph of construction costs, but it's a little bit U-shaped. The lowest costs are things like Turkey. There are things, so this is Japan, this is, okay, so South Korea, yeah, so South Korea, Spain, Portugal, Finland, which one would be Italy? This one, yeah. So yeah, Sweden is an example of a wealthy low-cost country. But the minimum is kind of obtained on the periphery of the developed world, and I think, and I've explained why I don't want to labor the point, but it's because they're very similar to the rich world, so it's easier for them to learn. And then in poor countries, I mean, okay, China, I don't want to call it a poor country, but China is pretty average. India is pretty average, but it's just because it's building out the subways would be more like here. This is Bangladesh, Vietnam, the Philippines, and the Philippines mostly builds Ls. Vietnam builds a max. Egypt, it's a max in the most recent subway, the recent one like here. Even Bangladesh, it's heavily elevated. So if you look at subways in these really poor countries, and not just the elevated lines, they're mostly going to be around here, so really expensive. So it's actually really difficult for them to afford subways, and it's something that they should work on. But I think they can work on that and get to about here, maybe a little bit lower. They can't get here. They can't be proportional to GDP to where even France and Germany are, let alone Spain. Does Cabrera have a street view? I have no idea. And even if it did, it is likely that the street view would only be maybe major streets, so there'd be things that are more that you think might be better off. So I know that, for example, in 19th century London, if you look at there's something called the poverty map of London. I think it's 1889. No, you're not going to see. Yeah. Okay, so red, in case people care, red means middle class, and the blues are various shades of working class. The darker, the worse. can kind of tell that in East London the main streets were colored red, and then the really poor bits were in the alleys. Um, so if your street view only looks at the equivalent of Whitechapel Road, it might miss how bad things are um, in the alleys. Um, Interestingly enough, by the way, for 19th century London, it was the main street remained middle class in the rich parts, and then the rich lived off the main streets to some extent. Um, I guess they were trying to avoid the very heavy horse traffic. So the main street here is red, not yellow. Yellow is the rich color. Um, but um, but anyway, so I don't know to what extent it matters to look at to look at street view. But the point is that these are neighborhoods that are very informal. The economy is informal. Property is informal. This is DeSoto's main insight. And DeSoto is not even studying Africa. It was studying way wealthier Latin America. But there too, you have informal property. You have a lot of informal government to the point that in I'm forgetting where in Brazil. I think it was in Rio. Um, the criminal gangs that kind of have their turf in the various favelas actually had to come up with their own corona guidelines. Things like you cannot be outside after a certain amount of time or something, or you have to wear a mask, because there was never going to be any kind of direct government enforcement. To the extent that there's police in these areas, it's kind of like the biggest criminal gang. And I do not know what the police brutality level in Kenya is. I know that in Latin America, it is very high, much higher than in the United States, for example, in Brazil or in Venezuela, or in the Philippines, which is not Latin America but has certain similarities. Um, and so these have very informal arrangements, and this means that people often work within the neighborhood. Um, and the kind of way that cities develop is that, first of all, in an early stage of development, so that would be, let's say, 19th century Brooklyn or early 21st century Nairobi, it's very common for people to just stay in the neighborhood almost their entire life. Certainly, they work within the neighborhood. So, are there commuters? Absolutely. I mean, there's the reason Kibera is here and not a random village elsewhere. But the but as I understand it, the large majority of the people in these slums stay in the slums. Um, and again, I shouldn't call them slums. I mean squats, because the fact that they're informal, this matters. Early and mid 20th century American slums were formal neighborhoods. The squats were in the 19th century, and the so in the squats, people tend to stay. And then again, I'm connecting this with 19th century Brooklyn because it was a thing in 19th century Brooklyn that you had people who lived in Brooklyn and possibly never visited Manhattan, or if they did, they very rarely visited Manhattan. Um, did people coming from Brooklyn to Manhattan? Absolutely. This is why Brooklyn exists. This is why people move to Brooklyn again, and not to literally any other place in the northern United States. But this was a narrow layer of commuters, and most of the population stuck within the area, with again very local arrangements, very local. So in 19th century, in not maybe not early 19th century, but certainly late 19th century, early 20th century, New Yorkers would be often mediated by ethnicity. So there would be the Italian orgs, the Irish orgs, the Polish orgs, Jewish orgs. Um, and I know that in India, I don't know about Kenya, but I know that in India it's like was mediated through, for example, where you came to Mumbai from, like what specific part of Maharashtra, or maybe even what kind of specific region. That is important. And but again, but this is also I'm relying on an old example, not necessarily something that's very recent examples. So it's possible that they're changing, right? Likely that they're changing. So, and this is a kind of the lower level of development. The next level of development is more and more people start commuting to city center. So city center grows in importance. And again, we can look at the history of New York, London, Paris. It started having a strong central business district that people commute to from all directions. In New York, this also led to a very prominent Manhattan skyline, to which people commuted from uptown Manhattan, from Brooklyn, from Queens, from Jersey. Um, and then the next stage is when the city starts. In America, it would be decentralizing, so there would be a lot of suburban sprawl and then suburban job sprawl. But it was not as local. It's very likely that people commute in a very job sprawly environment like the United States. They commute from one suburb to another. It's not like you stay in Long Island your entire life, and even Long Island is an unusually isolated suburb. Even on Long Island, it's likely you socialize in the city. If you work in Long Island, which is common, people in Long Island are likelier to work within Long Island than in the city. You don't work in the same municipality that you live in. It's very rare. It's likely you work in another part, in one of the many office parks. And again, Long Island is unusually isolated and unusually weakly job sprawly. And it's much more prominent in places that are less isolated and more job sprawly. For example, in the Connecticut suburbs of New York, there's no connection between where you live and where you work. I mean, you live in one white flight Connecticut suburb, you work in another like Stamford or Greenwich, um, or in an office park wherever. Um, so it's much more mobile. It's called in John Adams, it's called hypermobility. But here we don't see that. We see the opposite. We see hypomobility. We see less commuting. This is going to be relevant because it means that ridership is not going to be what quote unquote should be from richer places. And this was a big problem in Addis Ababa. And my reference to this is Christina Goldbaum. She's the Metro reporter. She's the Metro desk reporter for the New York Times. She used to freelance out of East Africa, and she told me that in Addis Ababa, the light rail system is underperforming, and she gives a bunch of reasons that I'm going to go over very shortly. But one of them is that people don't commute to city center as much as in richer cities because the urban geography, even if it's a big dense city, is still more local, and it's taking time uh, for urban arrangements to, I don't know whether to call it to modernize or to corporatize or to um, I don't know, first world eyes, but a situation in which you don't work for your cousin, you work for a big business, or if you don't work for a small business, it's going to be an SME with 150 employees rather than your cousin. Um, you you have work-life separation, and I don't mean in the modern sense of work-life balance, which is in a very rich city in which people say work-life balance and mean we don't work 80 hours a week, we only work 60. I mean it in the sense that um, you work in arrangements that are separate from where you live. It's not based on family ties. It is not based on it is not based on communal ties, or maybe it's based on very large scale ethnic ties. But even then, usually when that happens, it's an indicator that there's something rather weird. I mean, in America, you have a lot of racial segregation in housing and in socialization. Most black people work for white people. Um, so the and this by the way took a while to become the situation. I think this was not the case until I can't tell whether it only stopped being the case during the civil rights during after the passage of the Civil Rights Act or shortly before it. Um, but the point is that you have capitalist ties. You have in the more modern situation. So there's an employer, so there's a boss worker relationship. This relationship can be oppositional. If the worker gets paid a lot less than the boss and is socially very different from the boss, for example, an industrial worker is likely to be in such an adversarial arrangement, or a service worker at a big retail concern, or a construction worker. Um, there's a this was if you follow American political bullshit discourse, you may be aware that maybe just yesterday or the day before, um, when the Republican Party was looking for excuses to replace Liz Cheney with Elise Stefanik in some congressional leadership position, the justification that they gave was that Liz Cheney does not believe that Biden stole the election from Trump. And the specific line that they said was that you cannot run a railway where the locomotive driver hates the president of the railway. This was I guess it said railroad and not railway, but I'm quoting this verbatim or almost verbatim from memory. And this was then mocked in certain parts of left American Twitter or transit Twitter because the joke is that on American railways, and not just American ones, I don't think, all the locomotive drivers hate management. So maybe they're dysfunctional because the adversarial relationship between labor and management turned very toxic and very hostile. But even in places where it's much more conciliatory, like in most of Northern Europe, we have strikes, we have unions, we have workers who identify culturally and politically as workers oppositionally to their boss. And this is a part of modernization. And rather than as again, obviously, it's going to be very different for higher end work. So white collar workers often identify with the boss. They expect to maybe get promoted, and if they do really well, to become the boss. But this is the kind of modernization of social arrangements. And again, I keep quoting Alice Evans on this. She also argues that this is a necessary prerequisite for women's liberation. But it's not just that. It's a kind of modernization that happens in many ways, and this also means, in particular, that where you work and where you live are not necessarily going to be the same. Not necessarily going to be the same. Maybe you can work within walking distance of where you live and you have a nice commute, but you should not expect that. It's one city, and when you have one city, you want to concentrate jobs where people can get to them from all over, and this is how city centers develop. This is how downtown develops. And it's a process. So the Addis Ababa light rail underperforms. The ridership is very low right now. I expect, though, that unless Addis Ababa becomes, another very auto-oriented city in the future, that over time ridership will increase. The ridership on the London Underground, when it just opened, was very low for, I imagine, the same reason. So it's important to understand that rail will underperform early on because rail creates the modern downtown, just as modern downtown creates rail. So bear in mind when you build a subway, or in Addis Ababa's case, it's light rail, but it's mostly grade separated. They just severed the grade crossings, which is another of the problems of this system for Christina. So when you build urban rapid transit, don't expect it to have Western or East Asian ridership right away. It'll take time. In India too, it's taking time. So this is an important lesson that I think is key to developing world transit. In Latin America too, there were a lot of underperforming lines, and I think that a lot of the database that Ben Fluvbier uses to argue that rail projects tend to overestimate ridership. And I don't mean his database that people tend to underestimate cost, which is separate. His paper that people tend to overestimate ridership is based on sources that I believe the United States in the 1970s and 80s. This is a paper by Don Pickrell. I'm going to actually have to spell it on Google because I don't remember how to spell his name. It's Don Pickrell, maybe, or is this Pickrell with an E? Yeah. So this guy. So Don Pickrell, researcher, famous for other things, discovering cost overruns and ridership shortfalls in the US. And again, this is his papers, I believe, first late 80s, then updated into the early 90s. And Fluvberg was using his US data. He was also using papers about developing world transit in the 1980s and early 90s that would have mostly been Latin America. There was very, very little in developing Asia. And the issues there is the ridership was maybe estimated at the time. They thought that their economic growth would be higher because Latin America, the parts of Latin America that don't have oil had a crash in economic growth after 1973 and the oil crisis. The ones that do have oil, like Mexico, did well but then crashed after oil prices came down in the early 80s. So if they made ridership projections assuming higher ridership, they would underperform. This also happened in Asia, by the way, with the high-speed rail systems of South Korea and Taiwan. They projected based on pre-1997 economic growth rates, so they underperformed when they opened, but they opened 15 years ago or so, and at this point, they're starting to get close to where they're starting to match the original projections. It's just that it's taking time. So again, it'll take time. You need more growth. You kind of so again, not relevant to South Korea and Taiwan, but relevant to a poor country that's building its urban transit systems. Um, it'll build downtown over time. So over time, it'll get very busy, but not yet. So this is the first one. So lesson number one: build rapid transit, but don't expect it to have first world or second world ridership yet. It'll take time to get there. Now next, you absolutely need to build rapid transit. BRT lives off of low labor costs. This is why it was invented in Brazil and Colombia. You have masses of drivers, fewer drivers than with jitneys because the vehicles are much bigger. BRT famously uses these giant bi-articulated buses, right? Bi-articulated bus. And note that they're immediately sending me to Curitiba. So these buses. So okay, this is a French example. This is okay. So this is in Guatemala. This is Curitiba, and it's 28 meters long. So well into light rail range. Be the low end of light rail range, within that range. So these are giant buses, and jitneys are not standard 12-meter buses. They're much smaller. They're mini buses. So they use less labor. It's not necessarily even about labor. It's often about capacity. But labor is important. And so so with BRT, they use it because remember, construction costs. So remember, construction costs are not lower in poor countries than in rich ones. So the affordability is worse than in rich countries. And wait, yeah, here. And more importantly, in the poorest countries, the costs are actually higher. And again, I'm connecting this with state capacity, but note that I have never defined state capacity in videos or on my blog. I might do so in the future. I know that there are researchers who have definitions of state capacity, but I haven't even linked to definitions. Again, it's in progress work how it connects with subways. But the point is that they have. So my point is that building infrastructure is expensive, but just spamming buses looks cheap for now, and that is the problem. Over time, the costs aren't going to get better. Unless you specifically invest in ways to reduce costs. You can't just expect economic growth to do this for you. And so over time, you're going to get more congestion. Over time, the city is going to grow bigger, and you want to make sure the city grows around a public transit system. And one of the problems is that in every developing world city, and this is something, remember I am lumping the Brazil and Mexico's of the world with the Kenyas and Bangladesh's and India's. Throughout this, most people don't own cars, but DLA always does. I think that, so even in Thailand, so let's drop the bond from this and Thailand in there. So Thailand is again, I don't like you maybe first, second, and third world because of the Cold War implications, but if you think of first, second, and third world as development indicators, Thailand is solidly second world. It's richer than China. I think it's a big enough difference that it will still hold true in 2020. Thailand has a very tourism-based economy, so even though it did really well in suppressing corona in 2020, it had a big economic contraction. Unlike countries that suppress and don't have tourism-based economies like Taiwan, Vietnam, New Zealand, Australia, even to some extent. Australia didn't suppress as well. South Korea didn't suppress as well. South Korea had a very small contraction. Um, but the but the point is that in Thailand, car ownership in Bangkok is not ubiquitous, but it's a majority. I think 70% of commuters in Bangkok drive, or maybe 65%. So it's something like 65 or 70%. 5% take the train, and the rest take a bus. And people take the bus in Bangkok out of poverty. But look, Thailand's on the wealthy end of this, and Thailand's also unusually auto-oriented with all these double-deck freeways. It compared this with Mexico. Mexico City has a giant subway system, which it hasn't really expanded in the last 20 years. Bangkok has a very small one. Bangkok is only now really expanding its subway, and even then it's going to be much smaller than Mexico City. So Mexico City kind of did the right things in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and then it stopped. But the point is that but most of these cities, the point is that most people don't drive. To the point that even in Thailand, which is the upper end of the income distribution here, and is unusually auto-oriented for its wealth level, and we're talking about Bangkok, so the city is always going to be richer than, especially the big city is going to be richer than the rest of the country. Even with that, car ownership is very common, but it is not quite universal. And elsewhere it's not. I mean, most people in Nigeria don't own cars, but the elite always does. Um, the local elites always do. So remember, I mentioned there's not very good state penetration. There's a lot of informality of not just labor, but but not work, but social relations. So the local big man, almost always a man, not a woman, owns a car. I want to say drives a car, but often has a driver. Um, doesn't find congestion. I mean, maybe finds congestion stressful, but it's never going to be but it's never going to be on a minibus. Might even be afraid of taking public transportation. And yes, crime rates in, for example, Nairobi are very high, but crime rates in Indian cities are not that high. And yet, there was literally a lawsuit against the bus lanes in Delhi in which a CEO who launched a lawsuit, which thankfully failed, but the surgery succeeded. The patient died. They ended up close the BRT in Delhi failed for other reasons, so they ended up closing it anyway. Um, so the lawsuit in Delhi against the bus lanes literally said it is okay if the grunt workers are late, but it is not okay if the CEO is late to work. With the expectation that the CEO would never be caught dead on a bus or maybe in general on public transit, but the CEO would be driven. So because you have these social relations, you don't necessarily have workers in a shop floor mentality saying you don't your boss needs you, you don't need your boss drives, but normal workers take public transit. So there's not that kind of agitation usually. There is a shuffle mentality. There are unions. Don't get me wrong, but it's not. I don't think as pervasive. Especially with something that looks rather wonky like transportation engineering. So you have societies that are not auto-oriented because most people don't own cars. It cannot be auto-oriented. It's like saying that um, it's like calling Germany a Muslim country, or calling France a Muslim country. Okay, France is something like 8% Muslim or something, and Germany is less than that. Um, and there's quite a lot of developing countries where, yeah, there are something like 8% of the population owns a car. So you can't call many of these cities like Lagos auto-oriented, but they are auto-dominated. So it's so the difference with this is that France might be 8% Muslim, but the elite is not Muslim. Practically nobody in the French elite is Muslim. The French elite loathes Muslims. Um, whereas the Nigerian elite drives. People want to be that. People want to succeed and then avoid the awfulness of public transport and then get a car because public transport is terrible because the same elites who drive do not care to invest in it. Um, and yes, I'm connecting this with weak state capacity in, for example, India or in Southeast Asia compared with East Asia at the same level of development. Um, but but again, I'm not necessarily going to explain why this is on a very abstract level. Just what is happening is these are auto-dominated but auto-oriented cities. So they need to build. So they need to absolutely allocate street space away from cars toward BRT early on, but also make sure that they can, as wages increase, make it a subway. They might even make it a subway early, to be honest, or an L. And L costs, they're not awful. In India, the L costs, they're not cheap, don't get me wrong, but they can build an L for 150 million per kilometer. Thailand is not very good at this, but Thailand is actually capable of doing so uh, so is this Thailand? Yeah, is capable of doing so. Not so much in Bangkok, but certainly, but in Chiang Mai, um, and I think also the mostly elevated lines of Bangkok. So they absolutely can do it. And if those cities are very big or expect to be very big, they can even get riders. But remember, build urban rapid transit. Don't expect, so that's the first lesson, and don't expect it to have um, overcrowded ridership from day one. It'll take time to build in that direction. Make sure that street space prioritizes public transportation, which might mean BRT. But remember, you will need to move from BRT to subways. Bogota is starting to build a metro. The construction costs are rather high. They're also rather strange. I saw a report comparing the elevated and the subway options. The elevated option was, I believe, all in PPP American dollars. I believe the elevated option turned out to be 250 million per kilometer, and the subway was 300. So this very narrow gap. Um, and I don't know why that is. Um, but the, uh, but you definitely need to prioritize that. Now, that being not being the gap, that being rapid transit. Now, another thing is use your very wide streets. All of these cities, not all, almost all of these cities, have very wide streets because they are not old historic cities. Or sometimes they are. Don't get me wrong. So some of these are the locations of very old historic places, but nearly all of their growth is going to be very modern, based on modernist principles. Countries that keep talking about how their values are superior to decadent Western values crave Western, crave the Western. I mean, they to the point that the alternative that they propose, with some exceptions, mostly Arab Islamist ones, most of the time they're just cribbing Western conservatism. They're cribbing Western conservative attitudes toward gay people, for example, that are maybe not within their tradition. Maybe at the time they didn't have a category of gay person, but they also didn't care very much. But it's mostly people who crave to be like mid-century British Tories or their French equivalents. So they thought that modernist development was better than cities with, let's say, narrow streets and mixed uses. So this is what they built. This is where you have these really tight zoning laws all over the developing world. Um, and definitely you need to upzone, but it itself is not going to save you. You need to actually build infrastructure. Um, and this is not something you can necessarily do as spontaneous action like with the jitneys because it's not something that you can do with individual drivers. I mean, you have individual drivers on trains, but you need to timetable the trains. You need to build the infrastructure. You need to build the trains. Um, and again, it requires an industrial organization, which exists. They just need to actually do it. And by the way, Kenya is capable of that. Kenya is not, again, the DRC may not be, which is why I'm not talking about the DRC, I'm talking about Kenya. Um, so use these really wide streets that were built in along modernist lines, often widened so that people could commute in their cars. Um, so you see this giant road, Forest Road. I mean, just look how wide it is. Um, it's basically a freeway. Um, so yeah, take this road, take 4 lanes, turn that into a subway, or maybe not a subway, but an elevated line even because it's so wide you can make space. Um, And so first of all, just do it. Second, you want to make sure that they form a coherent metro network within city center. So so on Forest Road does not go into city center, right? I mean, it goes up until here, and then you're dropping to other streets, which are much narrower. Here, you need to spend money on tunnels. These may be bored. These may involve complex stations. You still need to do it. This is really important. Um, and you want to do it now and not later when, for example, property values are going to be higher. Um, so when I say coherent, what I mean is that the shape of the network within city center should look like you can get between any point and any point within roughly where I'm circling. So that would be city center, very near center areas like Ngara, maybe Eastleigh, certainly Parklands and Westland, just because the rich people live here, so there's some migration of jobs in this direction. I think the high-end retail is mostly here. So you want to build a coherent network within it. So I mean, yes, on these roads, you absolutely are going to have lines that fan out of city center in all directions, but you want to make sure that you can transfer around here. You might need to occasionally do a short tunnel, veering away. In some places, you might just carve right of way if the property values are not too high, but please just compensate workers. Like compensate the owners and the renters if you're actually carving a new road through Kibera or something. Like I can guarantee you that when this was built, the highway here, they did not compensate people. Um, so so you want to upzone. So you see all these golf courses; these need to be housing. Um, and then also allow taller buildings in desirable areas. You want to build a system that does have some subway, some tunneling, even if it's expensive, in the very center of the city. Again, don't tunnel in the suburbs just for the sake of it. Don't do the mistakes that New York made in the 30s. Build like New York built in the 1910s. Now, on the subject of building like New York did in the 10s, build four-track main lines. This is not common anymore. Because it was mostly a New York curiosity based on the fact that New York was very large and had very wide streets, or rather very wide uninterrupted streets. Paris has wide streets, but there are always little interruptions, so they only built two tracks on the metro. And they didn't really even care about long distance because they were trying to keep out the suburbanites. Again, the urban elites think that the poor people are dirty and smelly. In Paris, even then in the late 19th century, rich people and the middle class lived in the city, the poor lived in the suburbs. France drives on the right, but the trains in France drive on the left. But the metro drives on the right because they wanted to keep out the commuter trains, because the commuter trains served the working class in the suburbs, and the urban elite thinks that poor people are smelly and dirty. So you want to build four-track lanes because Nairobi is a big city. It's, I think, 4 million people and growing very quickly because the urbanization rates are increasing. There's going to be a lot of internal migration, and there's going to be a lot of natural growth rate. Nairobi, as I said, it will be a mega city. It might even, it's likely that it's even going to be a hyper city by the end of the century. That's going to be 20 million, not 10 million for a mega city. So you want to make sure you have the maximum capacity and build it now. Building two tracks first and then making it four tracks is really expensive. So just start with this. This is also going to get you faster trains. Again, build elevated. Don't build steel L's like in New York. They're very noisy. Build concrete L's. If you build subways, build them cut and cover. It's going to be really annoying for drivers to deal with the disruption, but cut and cover is much more labor intensive than boring. Boring is something that is done with very few workers and very complex machinery that is only manufactured in a handful of places in the world. I don't even know if there are companies other than Herrenknecht that make TBMs for the global market. Are there cases where people have combined highway and subway construction? Yes, but I don't think they're very good. it tends to compromise the alignments for both. It tends to build freeways and just dump more cars into the city. Tel Aviv is doing that, and it's not very good. And Tel Aviv, they're also not in the city, but in the suburbs, they're building commuter lines, either in freeway medians. I guess Tel Aviv did it in the 90s when they built the Island Freeway. It's gonna dump a lot of traffic, a lot of pollution, kind of decentralize the city. So don't combine them. I mean, often the optimal alignments are not the same. So just, I mean, if you want to build a highway, build a highway. I don't think you should, but you should focus on subways on existing arterials, and not freeways. Freeways. The thing is, when you build a subway on an arterial, the arterial becomes a major commercial street that people walk on. If it's a freeway, they don't. Um, and there's a big difference. And so anyway, you want to build these things as subways. You want to plan well in advance because again, the city's going to grow. So when you build line 1, you should know where line 20 is going to go. Maybe not 20, but line 10 definitely, so that the system can be coherent. So that if you need shared segments, they can already be built prior, so that you don't need to reopen a tunnel at high cost. You should know where the main transfer stations are. So again, you can build them ahead of time, because if you take a station and build a transfer much later without having pre-planned, it's just going to be more expensive. This is actually done in Berlin. Not the pre-planned. I mean, in Berlin they pre-planned, but the U5 extension they built was not pre-planned. So when they so Google Earth is not going to show this, because Google Earth is not showing a lot of very recent openings. It's not showing Second Avenue subway in New York either, for example. And likewise, it's not showing U5. So this is U5. All these uses are U5. This is U5, the main east-west line. It used to terminate here at Alexanderplatz, but it was then extended, in fact, opened just last year between Alexanderplatz, Rotes Rathaus, Museenzel, unter den Linden, and then to this already built line that used to be called U55 and is now just part of U5 to Hauptbahnhof. And here's the thing, this stop, unter den Linden, this is the transfer to U6. The previous U6 stop was called Französische Straße. It's not normal to me to say St, not St. Sorry. But they actually moved things around to move it closer to Unter den Linden. So now the stations are called Unter den Linden. And they had to, so they bored underneath very easily, but when they built the station couldn't cover here, they had to dig underneath this old fully cut and cover line for U6, and this was kind of difficult. And the costs were rather high. I mean, they were not America high, but they were Europe high. And so you want to know in advance and build some pre-existing segments, as they did for U5. Again, not around here, but around Alexanderplatz, they already built parts of the connection towards Rotes Rathaus, and even a different one, so that you could build U10, a proposed subway line that is going to go something like this, that they're not going to build, but instead they're going to turn it into a tramway. Or rather, they're going to build it. I mean, tramway runs as part of the corridor, is going to extend the tramway over the full corridor through West Berlin. So, and you have all these little bell mouths in New York, these little lower levels in New York and in Berlin for expansions that never happened. So plan in advance in a city like Dhaka, Nairobi, Karachi. And again, use techniques that are labor intensive. Cut and cover is very labor intensive. Tunnel boring machines 120 years ago were also labor intensive, but over time they've become less labor intensive and more capital intensive. And they've actually overshot to the point that at this point, even in developed countries, they're more expensive than cut and cover. But certainly in poor countries, you have an army of reserve labor, so just put people with drills and open up streets and put tracks in there and uncover. So learn historically what techniques were used in rich countries back when they had similar levels of development to present day India or Kenya. That's going to be, I think, a lot more useful than inviting consultancies that consultants are very familiar with how things are being done in um, rich countries today when the average income is 6 times, it's 7 or 8 times that of India. Um, so, so again, it's all about internal learning. Very stretch their capacity. You can outsource it to a consulting consultant. A global consultancy doesn't care how things were done 100 years ago. Most of its work is in rich countries. They don't care. Um, so you need to learn this yourself if you're in a poor country, or if you're the World Bank, maybe it's useful to learn it and then kind of become a dedicated consultancy to low income countries, but as something very specific, and you need to be using different engineering techniques and different management techniques um, from from turnkey first world things. And so this is so again, it's different from just inviting Japan or inviting China to build your infrastructure. That's going to be a disaster. Look at the Vietnamese costs. And these are lines that are mixed sideways now. I mean, one of them they invited China to build it, the other Japan. Um, the Chinese one was, I think, more delayed, but they're both really expensive. Um, so this is how you're going to. So this is how you need to build in very poor countries. But honestly, even in middle-income countries, you should be building more of this because you have wide-ass streets. In Mexico City, for example. So again, Mexico is richer than China. I don't like calling it a poor country, but um, but let's go here for a moment. Yeah. But the system has kind of stagnated, and yeah, they got BRT, but it's not good enough. The Metrobus system, and the commuter rail in Mexico is not very good. They kind of learned too much from America. They have their American style. They have a very American style commuter rail network. I'm not doing commuter rail, intercity rail network, by which I mean no intercity rail. I don't mean Amtrak. They actually don't have intercity rail. They stopped operating. It's all just buses, and they have a little bit of commuter rail in Mexico City, but not really. And they probably should just be building RER tunnels with connections to the main subway, to the main interchanges with the metro. So something like something like Insurgentas is a really good um, route for this. Um, and there are others I just don't know them as well. And um, and so you want to throw around, you want so when I talk about running, it's also really important, as I said, to talk about coherence. So this would be a network where in the inner parts, so if it's a commuter rail network, it's within the city. If it's subway network, it's within the city. A by coherence, I mean something where you can get between points. Something that maybe at higher altitude is star shaped, but at a lower altitude isn't. And I think it's really important, especially for a growing city, because you're probably going to birth central business districts at all the major at all the major transfer points. So you want to make sure that they form a structure. They don't have that it's not just a bunch of lines that only ever intersect in a tiny city center and not in a slightly larger zone. You want to make sure that the lines intersect and actually have transfers. Um, so so again, it's really important to think ahead. It's because remember, high demographic growth is likely. High economic growth is likely just because of convergence. Um, Changes in urban geography and the kind of modernization of labor from family scale production to um, either SMEs or more the M, then that's the S side of SME, or much more likely big business, um, work-life separation. Um, all of these are going to lead to the formation of central business districts, which again exist, but they're not as strong. So the formation of strong city centers, and if people don't work in city centers, they work in specific job centers that you can shape to be near intersection points of trains, just as they did in Paris. La Défense was built concurrently with the RER. Parc Dieu in Lyon was built concurrently with the TGV and with the Lyon Metro. You can absolutely do it. It just requires foresight. So this is the main issue, I think, for developing world subways. It requires knowing in advance early, which again, at this point, there's a lot of literature in economic development, a lot of understanding of good institutional arrangements, and the understanding of the concept of convergence, which is older, to be honest. The understanding that no, we're not all going to live in the utopia that General Motors promised in the middle of the 20th century. Modernization has moved on. So the idea of what is modern has moved on from everyone owns a car to something else, to maybe not ever, so maybe from everyone owns a car to people just don't need to own a car. Um, but it, but again, it requires maybe modernizing the idea of what it means to be modern. Um, and and this is, I guess, the big problem. It's not just that they're building subways at very high cost. They are, but they're just not building enough, even often relative to their costs. Um, and so, for example, the Lagos metro is just stuck in limbo. Um, it's not even that expensive because it's all elevated. For elevated, it's very expensive, but it's elevated. It's just that they're building just one sad line, it's called the Blue Line, on the Badagry Expressway. And it's not even gonna serve the heart of Lagos Island. It's gonna go through Lagos Island and it's going to go around here because they didn't want to do a little bit of a subway on Lagos Island. This is what it means by coherence, by the way. It means something that, in the case of Lagos, it would be within Lagos Island and maybe the place where it's developing towards, that would be mostly east. So poor people live mainland, rich people live Lagos Island and Lekki. So they're building a new city here at Eco Atlantic because they clearly don't believe in climate adaptation. And so you want to build something that's a coherent network in Lagos Island, in Eco Atlantic, in between, on the nearest part of the mainland. Um, and the and as opposed to just a few lines go here and don't really connect well and don't really let you get between different parts of the CBD because there are lots of intercities interconnection. I mean, you work in one office building, you meet someone who works in another office building. You want to make sure that you don't have to hail a cab and instead can just take the subway 3 stops. Or take the subway, I don't know, 3 stops, change to another subway, then take another 4 stops. That's absolutely a thing. This is what I mean by city center coherence again. Um, I'm not going to show crayon because there's no real point in that. The but the point is that you definitely need to use the roads you have, which again, Lagos has these, Dhaka has these, Karachi has these, Lahore has these. Use a lot of them. Build 4 tracks, not 2. Build concrete Ls, which is thankfully being done. Or cut and cover subways. When you can't use a concrete L, so maybe you don't have concrete L because you don't have a good street network internal to Lagos Sound. Okay, then either carve a new road or bore a little bit. I mean, if you do like 2 kilometers of boring, that's not gonna kill your budget. Um, so what is this? This is okay, 1.3 kilometers. That's fine. I mean, the stations are not gonna. I mean, the stations can still be done cut and cover because if you bore from the bridge to Tinubu Square, then you're just gonna open up Tinubu Square and build a cut and cover station here. Um, build full size things. So okay, so maybe here this is not full size. Okay, then go and do that. Or honestly, demolish buildings. Um, don't worry about driverless anything. Electronics are useful, but concrete before electronics. You're a poor country. Electronics are expensive. And you can redo them later in ways that you can't with concrete. So anyway, this is what you should be doing in developing countries. Um, Different from the prescription for economically mature cities. But still, they need rapid transit, don't get me wrong. They just need it done right. So are wealthy NIMBYs in developing world cities as effective at preventing infrastructure construction as those in first world cities? The answer is I don't know. In India, the in India, my understanding is that it's not a matter of wealthy NIMBYs. So it's not people saying, "Oh my God, if you build taller buildings, then poor people will move to the city and think about the property values," because poor people already live in these cities. It's more. So what I heard is that in Mumbai specifically, the developers don't care about upzoning the formal neighborhoods because they figure that they can just seize informal squats for zero because these are informal neighborhoods without dated property. So they don't. So often the developers don't care. So Mumbai is a very weird situation in which you look at what left NIMBYs say about predatory development, about predatory developers in cities like Los Angeles, and it's complete hogwash in the developed world, and it's also, I think, hogwash in most of the developing world, but I think in Mumbai specifically it is actually correct. That yeah, there's app zoning, but developers are still maybe they build more in the upzoned areas, but they're still holding out for trying to just seize informal squats without compensation. Um, a lot of it is not as much NIMBYs as planners that genuinely believe this, whereas in the United States, planners believe that TOD is a good thing. I mean, planners are also taught to be very differential to the NIMBYs so that they don't think that their planning degrees make them make them more informed about how cities should be planned than someone who merely happens to have owned property and benefit from the housing shortage and have political connections. But they absolutely are told about TOD. It's just my understanding is that it's just like the I say the elites, but I don't think it's just local NIMBY elites. So in the developed world, the issue is that you have local NIMBY elites that are anti-developmental, and you have national elites. So these would be the professional middle class, for example. So that would be, in this case, the planners, who are much more pro-development. And I don't think that that is a big difference as much in developing countries. If that makes sense, Deborah. Okay, and you're asking me also about infrastructure. So I was talking about housing and about infrastructure. Um, I don't know. I don't think it's a matter of NIMBYism. The biggest concerns seem to be cost. They absolutely do block things that take away street space from cars. Maybe they block things that maybe they block methods that use cut and cover. I do not know. I don't think that that is why they're not using cut and cover. I think they just don't use it because the developer doesn't use it. Because but again, I don't know. Are there other questions? I'm gonna end this stream soon, so are there more questions about developing world public transportation? Again, I mean, usually what I usually do is I give this like 2 more minutes because I know that I'm lagging a little bit, or your chat is lagging, so I don't want to so I don't want to cut this before people have had a chance to type a question or something. Oh, labor intensive methods, yes. Oh, what labor intensive methods are there apart from cut and cover? So you could do tunneling shields with lots of labor, which is how it was done in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but I don't actually know how this was done, and it might still involve specialized machinery that no longer exists. So TPMs still involve manufactured capital goods. Back when New York, for example, was building underwater tunnels for the subway under the East River, for example, or under the Hudson for Path. Um, they weren't as automated as modern TPMs, of course. And of course, most of New York did couldn't cover, but they did use TPMs even in New York and in Paris to go underwater. And of course, in London, they started with underwater and then transitioned to doing this under land. Um, and and I don't think necessarily these things are being manufactured anymore because who needs that? What are brick else? I don't know. So I do know that stone construction, yeah, it is very labor intensive. It has very little embedded carbon. This is something that was explained to me by I believe by Omar Raz, um, who I think Pez on Twitter. That concrete has high embedded carbon. I mean, there's things like infra lightweight concrete that has less, or mass timber, but the concrete can be done in a very interchangeable way. Stone, you just mine stone. I mean, it's not like producing concrete, which produces CO2 from the chemical process. Stone doesn't do that. But construction of stone, I don't think it's the mining. I don't think it's the quarrying. I think it's the construction with stone is just very labor intensive. Um, so to the point that it only really exists in rich countries where it's mandated, like in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, you are required to build out of stone for historic purposes, like because this is how the city used to look. So you don't want to have jarring modern buildings in the old city or something. Um, but it's understood to be very labor intensive and very expensive as a result. Brick, I don't know. I mean, maybe, but the issue is not like the construction cost is not so much that the cost of the concrete itself is really high. Um, it's as I understand, it's everything else. It's things like building pillars. Can you do it for cheap with bricks? Maybe I don't know, but the big differences with subways with doing it cut and cover rather than DBM. Um, does that answer your question? Oh, are there developing cities that follow any of these recommended practices? No. Um, so they do build lots of Ls, but they tend to invite in consultants from rich countries that tell them how to build based on rich country labor capital ratios. Um, and the, so let me see. Okay, so look here. The poorest country that's 100 or so is Turkey, and Turkey is not a poor country. And I mean, yeah, okay, Bulgaria is kind of cheap. Um, Uzbekistan, this is an L, I believe. Um, I believe. And also Uzbekistan, I mean, it has low GDP per capita, but it's kind of like a poorer version of Russia. It's not like ex-colonies that are very different. This is mostly L, so it's expensive. Let me see if we can find Ecuador here. Yeah, Chile is not a poor country. And this is, this is not going to be Mexico. Which one is Ecuador? Also, Ecuador would be this color. It's Peru, Argentina. Oh, this is Ecuador. Yeah, so Ecuador is poor, and this is a subway, I believe. Um, um, Ecuador lucked out; they use Spanish consultants. Um, but even then, that's not that cheap. And Ecuador, first of all, is richer than, look, this is Ecuador, this is India, and they may look close on a scale that goes up to 100,000 is linear, but the distance between them is a factor of about two. And so so no poor country gets this well, unfortunately. This is a big drag on their development. Um, there are some that prefer, most of them don't prefer BRT, most of them build subways. I mean, occasionally see a pure BRT example like Dar es Salaam, but usually even if they do BRT, it's a combo, like in Jakarta. Um, Larry, did I answer your question? By the way, if other people have questions about this, then shoot. Um, as I said, I want to be done by 8 or before 8, and it's now 7:50. Um, but if people, again, if people have yeah, I mean, it's really sad. I mean, and there's this idea that there's kind of a pure third world uncorrupted by zoning or uncorrupted by high construction costs or something. It's not. It really isn't. I mean, the idea. I mean, maybe you sometimes hear about specific transplant factory owners, the sort of people who transplant a factory into the Philippines for a lower wage, and they say how nice it is there that the workers don't go on strike. But this is often very specific to manufacturing, and convergence in not manufacturing is much harder, and construction in particular tends to lag a lot. Yeah, the best practices are known, but consultancies are bad at disseminating. I mean, it's not that consultancies know the best practices and don't disseminate them all. The consultancies know practices that, first of all, I don't think they're that good because the global consultancies tend to come from the professional services world, and that is a mostly Anglo world. So they know what they think works in the US and UK, and then they inflict poor American and British practices on other places. But separately from that, even the ones that knew good French practices don't necessarily know how to adapt them locally. Um, there some there are some exceptions. The Maghreb is a big exception. It's not that poor, so I'm not putting it in my list of poor countries. Um, but France never truly economically decolonized Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. So, for example, the high-speed rail in Morocco is a turnkey TGV, and it's actually really cheap. The construction costs were incredibly cheap. And likewise in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, they're light rail systems. There's a lot of Alstom involvement, but Alstom is not a drive-by consultancy. It has a long-standing presence in those countries, so they know how to adapt to local conditions. But these are local middle-income conditions. Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco are not poor countries. Um, so let's wipe a few things. Bangladesh. This is Morocco. So Morocco is going to be. I do not remember Algeria or Tunisia. Um, okay, so Morocco is somewhat richer than India, but it's still richer than India, and India is richer than practically all of Africa. Algeria and Tunisia, I think, are richer. So this is Algeria. This is Tunisian because um oh DZ is Algeria, right? And Tunisia is TN. Algeria and Tunisia, I mean, they're five figures. Again, Morocco is poorer, but even while being poorer, Morocco is still richer than India. So France knows the local conditions in those three specific countries. Because again, there was never any kind of economic decolonization. But the global consultants, why do they know? Why do they care? I mean, yes, they get some money out of consulting in Kenya and in Nigeria and India. Less so in India, it's more Kenya. It's more like India is big enough and rich enough. It is mostly failing for its own domestic reasons. But the consultancies get a lot of work in poor countries, often in Southeast Asia, maybe in Bangladesh, and in pretty much all of Africa. But they don't. I mean, yes, they get money from this, but they get most of their money from telling an American city how to do what it should be able to do in the public sector, but can't because of 30 years of budget cuts. So their main use case is so different that it's not. So they don't necessarily know the good practices for countries that have the GDP per capita of Kenya or India, if that makes sense. And as for how that can change, you can do it with state capacity, but I mean, it's like saying you can. It's like, but honestly, telling a country like India to develop better state capacity, it's a little bit like telling it to stop being. It's like telling people to stop being poor. Okay, I mean, if a person who is um, let's not even say on welfare. If it's a person who doesn't even know how to fill in the forms for welfare, and I message a person in Berlin, in fact, telling them to stop being poor, that's not going to help, right? I mean, maybe they need help with filling in their forms for welfare, filling in their forms for to get a social worker, filling in forms to go to uni. Again, the person I'm thinking of specifically absolutely could, like get a CS degree or something. The but telling him to stop being poor, that's I mean that's kind of bullshit, right? And the same way telling a country to develop the capacity. How to do it, I don't know. Um, I hope to know in coming months. One of the things that we might branch out our project from, which is currently a mostly developed world subway cost comparison, is to disseminate good practices for developing countries, possibly doing something completely different with high-speed rail, possibly doing something with things that are not subways, but let's say street redesigns, bus lanes, bike lanes, streetcars, and so on. Um, but so again, I don't know. My guess is the World Bank needs to kind of become the third world's consultant on this, staffed with people whose expertise is based on knowledge that is relevant for third world situations. In the same way that the IMF is not necessarily going to recommend the same things in a rich country as in a poor country. And maybe the things the IMF recommends in rich countries are terrible, but the IMF's restructuring proposals were based on specific things to the situation of Latin America in the 1980s. So the level of rule of law that was common in Latin America in the 1980s, the domestic savings rates that were specific to Latin America in that era, which were very low, so it was a very capital-starved part of the world, so they needed a lot of foreign investment. And even in other parts of the middle-income world, like 1990s South Korea, they kind of derped the IMF just because the domestic saving rate in Asia was much higher. So so IMF demands to mollify international investment, to mollify international investors weren't as useful. Malaysia just ignored everything the IMF said and actually did well in the after the 1997 financial crisis, just because there was enough domestic capital. But so this is something that the World Bank might actually want to pick up on and learn how to deal with, and because the World Bank is financing so much infrastructure, it absolutely can and should learn how to do better infrastructure in countries with a specific income level. So let's call it the Kenya to the India, or maybe the Kenya to the Morocco income level. So things are not desperately poor the way that the DRC is, but still very poor, mostly rural, not fully literate countries, if that makes sense. By the way, does that answer your bigger question about how that can change? Yeah, again, the World Bank is just an institution. No, it's possible that there are others. I don't know. I hope to know more at the end of the year. Um, but right now, I can just guess that it would be something that the World Bank should get involved in. I mean, I think the Asian Investment Bank could do this very well, but that requires Japan to kind of stop being Japan. Japan is really bad at understanding that there sometimes need to be local adjustments made. Their experience of Taiwan made them insist on Turkish Shinkansen, for example. So in India, as a result, the construction costs for the high-speed rail in India, the construction costs are horrific because of turnkey Shinkansen problems. Something I think the World Bank would actually do better than the EIB then. The EIB is completely irrelevant. The EIB is for Eastern Europe and Turkey. On that note, I think I'm going to stop. As I said, at 8. Actually, wrapping it up with a solution. You're not doing this to me. Come on. How? All right. So I am going to stop here. Thanks for watching. I don't know what my topic is going to be in a week. On Patreon, I'm going to ask people what they think. I haven't gotten good suggestions yet. Yeah, thanks for sticking around.